She was 11 days postpartum when she walked into the most expensive law firm in Manhattan. The baby was against her chest. Her folder was in her hand. And she was ready. Clara Whitfield had dressed carefully that morning. Not because she wanted a scene, but because she had learned, over 3 years of marriage to Derek Whitfield, that the way you carry yourself in the hardest moments is the only thing entirely yours. A cream blouse, dark slacks that still didn't button all the way, a navy coat that covered everything. Her green eyes were steady. Only someone who knew her very well would have noticed a slight tremor in her right hand as she pressed the elevator button for the 14th floor. Nobody in that building knew her that well anymore. The baby, she had named him Miles, a name Derek had never agreed to or disagreed with, because Derek had not been present for most of the decisions of the past 8 months, was wrapped tightly against her in a soft gray carrier. He was asleep, his tiny mouth slightly open, his fingers curled into loose fists beside his face. Clara had timed his feeding for 40 minutes before the appointment. In 11 days, she had learned to plan everything around the short windows of calm. She had learned a great many things in 11 days that she hadn't expected to learn so soon. The elevator opened onto white marble floors, low leather chairs, a single orchid on a glass table. A receptionist with perfect posture looked up with a practiced smile that communicated nothing. Clara Whitfield, Clara said. 10 o'clock with Mr. Hargrove. The woman's eyes dropped briefly to the baby. Of course. I'll let him know you've arrived. Clara sat down and kept her gaze on the orchid. She practiced a discipline she had been building for months. The way an athlete trains a movement until it becomes automatic. Think about the next hour. Think about what needs to happen. Don't think about the way it was supposed to be. She had married Derek Whitfield 3 years ago at a vineyard in Connecticut his family had owned for generations. She had been 28. He had been 34. She had loved him in a particular way you love someone who seems, at first, to be exactly what you needed. Steady, ambitious, attentive in precise moments when attention matters. What she hadn't known then was that attentiveness could be a strategy rather than a character trait. She learned that later. The first year was good. The second year, Derek's private equity firm made a series of acquisitions that pushed its valuation past $800 million. And Clara had watched her husband transform with the money, not dramatically, not all at once, but like a photograph developing in reverse, the colors slowly washing out. What remained was flatter and harder than what had been there before. He traveled more. He called less. When he was home, he was present in body only. She had tried. She wanted that acknowledged somewhere, even if only in her own memory. Couples counseling, Derek attended twice and declared it useless. Honesty. Sitting across from him at the kitchen table and saying plainly that she was losing him and didn't know how to stop it. He had looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite guilt, and said he was sorry she felt that way. 3 months later, she discovered he had been seeing someone else. She hadn't confronted him immediately. That surprised even her. She had always thought of herself as direct, as someone who handled things. But the discovery had knocked something loose, some foundational certainty about her own perceptions, and she needed time to reassemble before she could speak. She had also, by then, just discovered she was pregnant. She didn't tell Derek. Not at first. She needed to understand what she was going to do. Not about the baby. That decision came quickly and clearly. But about the marriage. About the man. About the next chapter of a life she was going to have to rebuild. She consulted a lawyer privately. She began quietly to prepare. She wore loose clothes. She worked from home. When Derek was in town, rare enough by then, they occupied the apartment like two people sharing a waiting room, polite and distant and careful. It was only at 7 months that he noticed. She had reached across the counter for something. Her shirt had pulled tight, and Derek had looked up from his phone and gone very still. Clara? Yes. He didn't speak for a long moment. How long? 7 months. She watched something complicated move across his face. Shock, certainly. And beneath it, something harder to name. Why didn't you? Because I needed to handle things in the right order, she said. And I needed to do it without asking you for anything. He had tried, in the weeks that followed, to reinsert himself, suddenly attentive, suddenly present. with the energy of a man who realizes he may have miscalculated. Clara had been kind, but clear. What she needed was a clean and fair resolution to a marriage that had ended before it officially ended, so she could give her son a stable foundation. She had not, however, anticipated what she found when she stepped through the glass door of the conference room. Her lawyer, Hargrove, was already seated. A tall man in his 60s with silver hair and the measured expression of someone who had managed other people's worst days for decades. Across from him sat Derek's lawyer, a younger man named Philip, and next to Philip, not waiting in a separate area, not standing to the side, but right there at the conference table, with a glass of water and her long legs crossed and a small controlled smile on her face, was Renata Collins. Clara had seen photographs of Renata. She had not expected to see her here. Derek sat at the head of the table, as far as possible from where Clara would sit. Charcoal suit, composed, closed off, like a building with all its curtains drawn. He was looking at his phone when Clara walked in. He looked up. His eyes went to her face first, then down to the carrier, to Miles, still asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the perfect regularity of the newly born. Derek Whitfield, who had negotiated the purchase of 4 companies in the past 18 months without visibly breaking a sweat, went completely, utterly still. "Good morning," Clara said. She sat down, adjusted the carrier so Miles was comfortable, and opened her folder. The room was very quiet. Whatever this meeting was supposed to be, a clean transfer of documents, a civilized ending, it was no longer going to be that. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Clara counted them without meaning to. It was a habit she had developed over the last year of her marriage, filling empty spaces with numbers, because numbers were reliable in a way words had stopped being. Hargrove broke it first, the way experienced lawyers do, by clearing his throat and opening a folder with practiced neutrality. Now that everyone is present, we can begin reviewing proposed settlement terms. Derek hadn't moved. His phone was dark, forgotten. His eyes moved from Miles to Clara's face and back again, doing the silent arithmetic she recognized. She had done the same calculation herself, alone in her bathroom with a calendar, months ago. It was Renata who spoke first, which surprised everyone, including, it seemed, Renata herself. "Is that—" She stopped. She looked at Derek. "Derek." He turned to her slowly, and for the first time, Renata Collins looked uncertain. She was a beautiful woman in precise, assembled way of someone who has invested considerable energy in the project. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Clara had researched her in the numb, methodical way she researched everything in those first weeks after discovering the affair. What she had not been able to determine from photographs and professional profiles was whether Renata had known about the pregnancy, whether Derek had told her. Looking at her face now, Clara made her assessment. Renata had not known about Miles. "He's 11 days old," Clara said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out simply like a statement of weather. Something crossed Renata's face that Clara hadn't expected. Not anger, or not only anger. Something that made her look, for a moment, much younger than 31. She pushed back on the table. Just an inch. The way a person does when they need space around a realization. "When did you find out?" Renata asked Derek. Her voice was very controlled. Derek set his phone on the table. 7 months ago. Renata nodded once, slowly. Then she gathered her bag from the floor, stood up, and said to Philip quietly, "I'll be outside." She walked to the door without looking at Clara, without looking at Derek, and pulled it shut behind her with a quietness that was somehow more pointed than a slam would have been. The room reorganized itself around her absence. Derek looked at Clara across the table. For the first time, the polish was gone. He looked like someone standing in a house after all the furniture has been removed. "His name is Miles," Clara said. It wasn't a concession. It was information delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a fact that exists whether or not the listener is ready for it. The settlement terms are fair. Hargrove can walk you through them. I'm not asking for anything I haven't earned, and I'm not preventing you from being involved in his life, if that's something you decide you want. But those are conversations for after today. Today we finish this. She watched him absorb that. Derek was, whatever else he was, an intelligent man. She could see him catching up to where she already was. The months she'd had to reach this particular state of clear-eyed practicality. The grief already moved through. He was arriving at a place she had already left. "You should have told me," he said. "I know," she said. "I made a choice. I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm asking you to sign the documents." Hargrove slid the first folder across the table. Miles shifted in the carrier just then, a small, involuntary movement, those tiny fists tightening. And for one unguarded second, Derek looked at his son with an expression Clara would think about later, alone in the quiet of the apartment after Miles had fallen asleep. It wasn't simple. It was the expression of someone confronting something they hadn't prepared for, something that doesn't fit into any of the categories they've built for themselves. She noted it, filed it, and returned her attention to the documents. But there was something she hadn't prepared for either. As Hargrove walked Derek through the terms, Philip received a message on his phone. He read it, frowned, and leaned over to Derek. This time, Derek listened. Something shifted in his posture that Clara couldn't immediately read. "There's a problem," Philip said, addressing the table, "with the Connecticut property." Hargrove looked up. "What kind of problem?" "The kind," Philip said carefully, "that requires us to revisit some foundational assumptions of the settlement." Clara looked at Hargrove. Miles slept on. Whatever clean ending she had planned for this morning, it was not going to be clean. The Connecticut vineyard had been in the Whitfield family for 40 years. Clara knew this because Derek had told her about it on a third date, walking through Central Park in October, the leaves doing what they do in New York in October, performing beauty with a kind of excess that makes people feel things they weren't planning to feel. He had talked about that vineyard with a warmth she'd never heard from him about anything else. His grandfather had planted the first vines. His father had expanded the cellar. Derek had spent every summer there until he was 16. It was, he had said, the only place he had ever felt like a person rather than Whitfield. Clara had loved that vineyard too, in the years when she was still allowed to love things that belonged to both of them. The Connecticut property, Philip said, was used 14 months ago as collateral for a private loan. The loan is currently in default. The room was very quiet. That property was listed as a joint marital asset, Hargrove said. Yes, that was an oversight on our client's part. Clara looked at Derek. You put the vineyard up as collateral without telling me. He met her eyes and didn't look away. She gave him credit for that. Even now, the company needed liquidity quickly, he said. It was supposed to be resolved within 90 days. It wasn't. Philip named a figure. Clara heard it and kept her face still with the same effort it takes to run the last mile of a very long race. The number changed the shape of the settlement significantly. The Connecticut property, which she had included as negotiating leverage, a chip she had planned to release gracefully in exchange for a clean financial separation, was now entangled in a debt that predated the divorce filing. The entire structure of the agreement she and Hargrove had spent 6 weeks building needed to be re-examined. She breathed in slowly. Miles made a small sound, not crying, just a soft vocalization of a sleeping newborn adjusting some interior change, and she put her hand against his back, feeling his warmth through the carrier. We'll need a recess, Hargrove said, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. He walked Clara to a smaller room down the hall. Plain table, no orchids. This changes our position, he said. The property issue could be resolved, but not today. We're looking at another 4 to 6 weeks while the loan situation is untangled. He paused. I want to be honest with you. If Derek's company is carrying more obligations like this one, there may be other assets that are similarly complicated. Clara sat down. Miles was waking now, moving from stillness into the restless pre-hunger state she had learned to recognize. She had maybe 10 minutes. Is he in financial trouble? She asked. Hargrove tilted his head. That's what I'd like to find out before we sign anything. In the weeks that followed that fractured meeting, Clara discovered that the vineyard was not the only complication. Hargrove, with the systematic thoroughness of a man who believed in earning his fees, pulled at the thread Philip had unwillingly provided, and found it was attached to something much larger. Derek's company, which had appeared from the outside to be a model of aggressive and successful growth, had been financing that growth in ways not visible on the surface. The acquisitions of the past 2 years, the ones that pushed the valuation past $800 million, and transformed Derek into someone the financial press was calling a visionary had been leveraged against future revenue projections that were, Hargrove's financial consultant told Clara, optimistic to the point of being speculative. He's not broke, the consultant said during a meeting in Hargrove's office on a Thursday afternoon, while Clara nursed Miles in a corner and took notes on her phone. But he's exposed. If 2 or 3 of those acquisitions underperform over the next 18 months, the structure gets very uncomfortable very quickly. And a divorce settlement, Clara said, would be a significant cash event, a moment when cash is not what is most of. She thought about the man she had married and the man she had watched him become, the particular loneliness of being close to someone and understanding them less and less as time goes on. And she thought about something else, something she hadn't told Hargrove yet, because she was still deciding what to do with it. 3 days after the failed meeting, she had received a message from an address she didn't recognize. It was brief. I think we should talk. Not about the divorce, about something I found out. RH. The initial was enough. Renata Collins. Clara had stared at that message for a long time. Every instinct, she had said, to ignore it. She had no obligation to Derek's girlfriend, no appetite for more complications. She had a newborn. She had a settlement to renegotiate. She had a life to rebuild. But the words "found out" stayed with her. Not want to say or need to tell you. Found out, which implied information that had come to light, which implied Renata had been looking or had stumbled onto something while looking for something else. She replied, "Coffee Friday. You pick the place." They met at a small cafe in the West Village. Neutral territory. Public enough to feel safe. Quiet enough to talk. Renata was already there when Clara arrived, sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around a mug, looking like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. The assembled composure of the conference room was gone. She looked like a person instead of a presentation. "Thank you for coming," Renata said. "You said you found something out," Clara said, and sat down. Renata nodded. She reached into her bag and placed a folded document on the table between them. "After the meeting, I went back through some things. Derek keeps copies of his financial records at the apartment. I've been staying there these past months." She paused. "I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was angry, and when I'm angry, I organize things." She looked at the document. "I found this in a folder in his study." Clara looked at it without touching it. "What is it?" "A transfer of funds, made 11 months ago, from his personal account, not the company, his personal account, to a holding company registered in Delaware." She paused. "The holding company's registered agent is Philip Crane. Philip, Derek's lawyer. That's not the part that matters most," Renata said. "Keep reading." Clara picked up the document. The transfer amount was significant. What made it notable was not the size, but the timing. The holding company had been established 2 months after transfer, which meant the money had existed somewhere in a gap. Transferred out of Derek's personal account before the company that was supposed to receive it had even been created. Where was it during those 2 months? Clara asked. "That's what I can't find," Renata said. "But I think—" She stopped, wrapped her hands around the mug again. "I think he was moving money before the divorce proceedings began. I think he knew, even then, that things were going to come apart. And I think he was making sure that when they did, certain assets would be somewhere you couldn't find them." Clara set the document down. Outside the cafe window, the street was doing its ordinary Tuesday morning business. People with coffee cups, a man walking a dog, a delivery truck blocking half the lane. She thought about the settlement, about the vineyard, about a man who had spent 2 years becoming someone she didn't recognize, and who had, it now appeared, been several moves ahead of everyone in the room, including his own lawyer, because Philip Crane's name was on that Delaware registration, and Philip Crane was supposed to be working for Derek. The call to Hargrove came at 7:15 on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the coffee with Renata, Clara made from her Brooklyn kitchen, while Miles sat at his bounce on the table, studying the window with the intense focus newborns apply to everything. As though the world is a problem they are actively working to solve. "The Delaware Company," Clara said without preamble. "I need you to pull everything on it." She sent the document that morning. Hargrove didn't push back. He didn't ask where it came from or whether they should second-guess it. He said, "Send it. I'll have my consultant look at it today." What they found over the following 2 weeks was not a single dramatic revelation. There was no smoking document, no cinematic moment of exposure. What there was instead was a pattern, the kind that only becomes visible when someone patient enough assembles all the pieces in the right order. Small transfers, a holding company whose timing was, the consultant said, consistent with deliberate pre-divorce asset repositioning. It was not illegal, strictly speaking. What it was a violation of the full financial disclosure requirement both parties had signed at the opening of proceedings. Derek had submitted an incomplete picture of his assets to court, which meant the settlement they had been negotiating was built on false ground. Hargrove filed a motion on a Wednesday. By Friday, Derek's legal team had requested an emergency call. Clara was not on that call. She spent that Friday afternoon at a park near her apartment, Miles in the stroller, walking the long loop around the pond that she had started doing in the mornings when the sleep deprivation was worst, and she needed to move in order to think. She thought about Derek, about the man she had married, and the choices he had made. And she thought about Renata Collins, who had walked out of that conference room with her dignity intact, and then 3 days later had done something Clara hadn't expected at all. She had chosen honesty over self-interest. Renata had nothing to gain from handing over that document. Derek's financial exposure was also, in some ways, Renata's problem. She had been living in his apartment, publicly linked to him. A scandal would touch her professional reputation, regardless of her involvement. The clean move, the self-protective move, would have been to say nothing, to let the divorce proceed on whatever terms it was going to proceed on, and to quietly extract herself. She hadn't done that. Clara had thought about why. She had arrived, eventually, at an answer she found both simple and unexpectedly moving. Renata had given her that document because it was the right thing to do, because whatever mistake she had made, whatever role she had played in the collapse of Clara's marriage, she had looked at a woman walking into a conference room with an 11-day-old baby and a folder of fair settlement terms, and she had recognized something that mattered more than her own convenience. Clara sent her a message after the motion was filed. 3 words, "Thank you, Renata." The reply came 6 hours later. "I'm sorry for all of it." Clara looked at that message for a long time. Then she typed "I know" and left it there. Because some things don't need more than that. And because she had Miles to feed. The settlement was renegotiated over 3 weeks in November. Derek, to his credit, and Clara was determined to give credit where it existed, even now, even to him, did not fight it. His legal team made the expected procedural objections. Philip Crane performed the obligations of a man caught in an awkward position and tried to minimize the visibility of his own role. But Derek himself, in the one direct conversation they had during that period, a 10-minute phone call, both of them standing in separate apartments in the same city, was quiet and direct. "I should have handled this differently," he said. "Yes, all of it, not just the legal part." She didn't respond to that. She had already said what needed to be said, and she wasn't interested in performing forgiveness for his benefit. "I want to be involved," he said. "With Miles, I know I don't have the right to ask." "You don't need the right," she said. "He needs a father who shows up. If you could be that, then be that. But it's not something you negotiate through lawyers. It's something you do or you don't." He was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said and ended the call. The final settlement was signed on the 14th of November, in the same conference room where it had all begun. The vineyard's debt was absorbed into the restructured terms. The Delaware holding company's assets were accounted for. Clara received a settlement that reflected an accurate picture of Derek's financial position. Not punitive, not excessive, but honest, which was all she had ever wanted. She signed her name in 3 places. Hargrove witnessed it. Philip Crane across the table had the expression of a man who had learned something expensive. Derek signed last. When he finished, he looked up and looked at Miles, who Clara had brought again, because she had decided her son was not something to be hidden or managed around. Derek looked at his son for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly, "He has your eyes." Clara looked down at Miles, who was awake and doing a serious examination of the ceiling lights. She felt something move through her. Not the old warmth, not that, but something adjacent to it. The residue of 5 years and a shared history and a person she had genuinely loved before she had needed to let him go. He does, she said. By January, Clara had made a decision that surprised even her. She had been offered a position, a real one, the kind she had put on hold when the marriage was absorbing all available energy, at an architecture firm in Portland, Oregon. She had a degree she had under-leveraged for 3 years. She had a son who was too young to have preferences about cities. She had a settlement that gave her options she hadn't had before. She called her sister Dana on a Tuesday evening and said, "I'm thinking about coming out there." Dana, who had visited twice during the pregnancy and stayed an extra week after Miles was born without being asked, was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she said, "I've been waiting for you to say that for 2 years. Clara laughed. The kind of laugh that happens when the body decides, without consulting you, that something is actually funny. Miles, startled by the sound, looked up at her with wide, dark eyes. "Okay," Clara said. "Then I'm saying it." She left New York on the 3rd of February. She drove to Portland over 4 days, stopping in places she had never been. Miles in his car seat behind her, the winter landscape changing to the windshield, flat to hilly to mountains to the long green descent toward the coast. On the second evening, she stopped in a small town in Montana, at a diner with vinyl booths and a pie case by the door. She ate apple pie and drank bad coffee and fed Miles and looked out the window at a street she had never seen before and would probably never see again. Sitting there, she felt something she recognized because she had felt it once before. On the evening of her first date with Derek, walking through Central Park, the leaves performing their annual beauty, the feeling of being at the beginning of something, the particular lightness of a life that hasn't happened yet. She left a good tip. She buckled Miles in carefully, checking the straps twice, the way she always did. She pulled out of the parking lot and onto a road that went west. Miles made a small sound from the back seat. Content, unhurried, already at home in the moving world. "I know," Clara said.